What's up everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. I saw a lot of buzz suggesting F-22s are massing for some imminent decapitation strike on Iran's leadership. I dug into this, and the actual reporting says the opposite. The Raptors were pulled out of the region on July 10th. So let's talk about what the F-22 has actually done in this war, why it mattered enormously in the opening days, and why its recent withdrawal might actually tell you something more interesting than any hours left countdown would. Back when this war opened on February 28th, about a dozen F-22 Raptors from the 1st Fighter Wing deployed to Avda Air Base in Israel as part of the build-up to the joint U.S.-Israeli strikes. Defense analyst Jack Buckby's assessment for 1945 described a stealth-first doctrine that let the coalition strike over 1,700 targets within the first 72 hours, effectively neutralizing Iran's aging air defenses. The F-22's specific job in that opening phase wasn't dropping bombs on leadership bunkers. It's an air superiority fighter, meaning its role was escorting strike aircraft and making sure Iranian jets couldn't contest U.S. and Israeli operations in the sky, while the F-35 handled strike and sensor duties, and the B-2 carried the actual bunker-busting payloads against hardened targets like Fordo. Later reporting indicates the Raptors flew more than 200 combat sorties during their deployment, reportedly threatening Iranian air defenses without ever being detected, exactly the kind of first-night stealth mission only an aircraft like the F-22 can pull off. Here's the actual news. The F-22s departed Israel and arrived at RAF Fairford in the UK on July the 10th, the same day Trump declared the ceasefire over, following the straight tanker attacks I've covered extensively in previous videos. That withdrawal wasn't isolated. 6 B-52 Stratofortress bombers left Fairford around the same period. 11 F-15E Strike Eagles returned home to RAF Lakenheath wearing kill markings, and a dozen A-10 Thunderbolts rotated out through Lakenheath as well in June. Not everything left, though. About 2 dozen B-1B Lancers, the aircraft I covered in my video on the GBU-72 bunker buster, remained parked at Fairford, along with a sizable force of Air Force and Navy fighters still in the region. A typical fighter squadron deployment runs about 6 months, and reporting notes it's genuinely unclear whether these departed jets will be replaced or simply stood down. That ambiguity is worth sitting with rather than over-interpreting in either direction. It could reflect standard rotational scheduling completely unrelated to the war's trajectory. It could reflect a deliberate shift toward relying more heavily on the B-1 and B-52 bomber-heavy approach I covered in my last video. Since those aircraft don't need F-22 air superiority, escort the same way in an environment where Iranian air defenses in western Iran have already been substantially suppressed. Or it could simply reflect the broader multi-theater strain I covered in my last video, the Indo-Pacific capability gap, the Venezuela and Caribbean operations, all pulling high-demand assets like the F-22 toward other priorities. I want to take a step back and actually explain this aircraft properly, because I've spent a lot of videos on this channel covering the B-2, the B-1, the GBU-57 and GBU-72, all strike-focused hardware, but I haven't given the F-22 its own proper technical breakdown yet, and it deserves one. The F-22 Raptor is fundamentally different in purpose from every other aircraft I've covered in this war. It's not designed to drop bombs on bunkers or bridges. It's designed to win the fight for the sky itself before anything else can happen safely. It combines extreme stealth, a radar cross-section reportedly smaller than a marble according to some public Air Force characterizations, with supercruise capability, meaning it can sustain supersonic speed without needing fuel-hungry afterburners, plus thrust vectoring nozzles that give it maneuverability most other fighters simply can't match. That combination exists for one specific purpose: to find and, if necessary, destroy enemy aircraft before those enemy aircraft even know the F-22 is there. In a conflict like this one, where I've covered extensively how much of America's targeting strategy depends on other, less stealthy platforms like the B-1 and B-52 being able to operate relatively safely once air defenses are suppressed, the F-22's actual contribution happens largely at the very beginning of a campaign, clearing the sky so everything that comes afterward, the strike packages, the bomber runs, the persistent ISR coverage, can operate with dramatically reduced risk. That's exactly why its role in this war was concentrated so heavily in those opening 72 hours back in February and March that I described earlier. Once that air superiority picture gets established and Iran's air force gets neutralized, the F-22's marginal value in a specific theater naturally declines relative to platforms actually built to deliver ongoing strike capability. I want to go deeper on something I only touched on briefly, because I think the pattern of departures matters more collectively than any single aircraft's movement does individually. Between the F-22s, the 6 B-52s, the 11 F-15E Strike Eagles, and the dozen A-10 Thunderbolts all rotating out of this specific theater within a relatively tight window over June and July, you're looking at a genuinely substantial drawdown of high-end combat air power from the Middle East theater specifically, even while the broader war with Iran was still very much ongoing, and, as I've covered in several other videos, actively escalating in other respects. That's worth sitting with because it doesn't fit a simple narrative in either direction. It's not consistent with the military preparing to stand down from this conflict entirely, since meaningful combat power, including ththose 24 B-1B Lancers I mentioned, remains actively based at Fairford and continues flying missions, as I documented in my video on the GBU-72 strikes. But it's also not consistent with the military gearing up for some dramatic, imminent new offensive requiring maximum air superiority coverage, which is exactly the kind of scenario that would call for keeping F-22s forward deployed rather than sending them home. The most plausible reading, based on everything in this reporting, is a military managing rotational deployment cycles and resource allocation across multiple simultaneous global commitments, the Indo-Pacific Gap General Smith acknowledged. The Venezuela and Caribbean operations I covered in my last video, all competing for the same finite pool of high-demand, low-density assets like the F-22, which the Air Force has never operated in particularly large numbers to begin with. Fewer than 200 were ever built in total before production ended years ago. This actually connects directly to a theme I've hit repeatedly throughout this entire series, whether I'm talking about the GBU-57's limited stockpile, the small B-2 fleet size, or now the F-22. The F-22 program was terminated after producing fewer than 200 aircraft, a decision made years before this war even started, driven by cost and a strategic pivot toward the F-35 as the more exportable, more numerous future fighter. That means the total pool of F-22s available for any single deployment anywhere in the world at any given time is inherently small and inherently precious. Every F-22 committed to this specific Middle East theater is an F-22 not available for deterrence duty in the Indo-Pacific, not available for homeland air defense rotations, not available for any other simultaneous priority the Air Force has to juggle. That scarcity is exactly why a rotational withdrawal like this one doesn't necessarily signal anything dramatic about the trajectory of the Iran war specifically. It's just as likely, maybe more likely, to reflect the Air Force's constant, ongoing balancing act trying to stretch an inherently limited fleet of irreplaceable aircraft across every global commitment simultaneously demanding access to it. Exactly the kind of multi-theater strain I laid out in detail in my video on the locked and loaded statement and its subsequent cancellation. I want to address something directly because I think it's important for anyone following this channel to understand how I approach stories like this one. A title suggesting an imminent decapitation strike with hours left on the clock generates attention. That's exactly why titles like that get used across this entire genre of war coverage content. But when the actual underlying reporting shows the opposite, aircraft leaving rather than massing, a countdown framing isn't just inaccurate, it actively misleads anyone trying to understand what's actually happening in this conflict. I'd rather tell you honestly that the F-22 story right now is a rotational withdrawal amid multi-theater strain than manufacture false urgency around an aircraft that's literally on its way out of the theater as I'm recording this. That doesn't mean this story is unimportant. Understanding why high-value assets are rotating in and out of this conflict tells you a lot about the actual state of American military commitment and strain, which I'd argue is more useful information than a fabricated countdown ever could be. If F-22s do get redeployed back to this theater in the future, especially alongside a genuine confirmed indication of an imminent strike on Iranian leadership specifically, that's a video I'll make the moment the reporting actually supports it, but I'm not going to manufacture that urgency out of an asset withdrawal that says the opposite. I think it's worth understanding that this aircraft's presence in the Middle East theater isn't unique to this specific war. It's part of a much longer pattern going back years. F-22s were deployed to the region as far back as August 2024, when CENTCOM confirmed additional Raptors arriving specifically to counter threats posed by Iran and Iranian-backed groups following the assassination of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. Defense analysts at the time described that deployment as the biggest crisis deployment ever for America's top warplane, with the F-22 specifically framed as capable of leading U.S. forces in a defensive shield across the region if Iran attempted another mass missile and drone attack. That earlier deployment pattern tells you something important about how the Pentagon has used this specific aircraft over the years, less as an offensive strike tool and more as a flexible, high-end deterrent and defensive asset that gets surged into a theater during moments of acute crisis and drawn back down once that immediate crisis passes. Seen through that lens, the current withdrawal fits a recognizable, recurring pattern rather than representing something unprecedented. The F-22 gets forward deployed during the sharpest, most uncertain phases of tension with Iran, exactly as it was back in February when this current war actually opened, and then gets pulled back once the acute phase requiring that specific air superiority guarantee is passed and the character of the conflict shifts toward the kind of sustained strike campaign that B-1s, B-52s, and B-2s are better suited for delivering. I also want to trace how the actual reliance on stealth capability has shifted as this war has progressed, because I think it explains the F-22's declining relevance in this specific theater better than any single explanation on its own. In the opening 72 hours back in February and March, stealth was the entire ballgame. Buckby's analysis specifically credited the stealth-first doctrine combining B-2s and F-22s for enabling that rapid 1,700 target opening campaign against an Iranian air defense network that was, at that point, still fully intact and genuinely threatening. But by the time I covered the B-1 and B-52 deployments to Fairford in my more recent videos, the entire calculus had shifted. Those non-stealth bombers were explicitly described as operating specifically because sufficient air superiority had already been established over at least the western portions of Iranian territory, meaning the extremely expensive, extremely scarce stealth guarantee the F-22 and B-2 provide was no longer strictly necessary for continued operations in that specific geography. That's a textbook example of how air campaigns typically evolve over their life cycle. Stealth assets do the highest risk, highest value work of breaking open an integrated air defense network in the opening phase. And once that network is sufficiently degraded, less exotic, more numerous, and more cost-effective platforms can sustain the follow-on campaign without needing to commit those same scarce stealth assets indefinitely. Understanding that evolution is exactly why I don't read the F-22's departure as an alarming signal. It's the natural, expected progression of exactly the kind of sequenced air campaign I've been documenting across this entire series. I also want to draw out a distinction I mentioned briefly, because I think understanding the division of labor between America's two stealth fighter types clarifies exactly why the F-22 specifically was the one that ended up rotating home while other stealth and strike assets remained. The F-35 Lightning II, while also a stealth aircraft, serves a fundamentally different role than the F-22 despite some surface-level similarities. The F-35 is built primarily as a strike aircraft and an advanced sensor platform, capable of detecting enemy radar systems and coordinating attacks across multiple other systems and platforms simultaneously, functioning almost like a flying quarterback for a broader strike package, as much as a shooter in its own right. The F-22, by contrast, remains far more specialized and far more singularly focused on air-to-air superiority, with limited strike capability by comparison. That specialization is exactly why, once Iran's air defense and air force threat had been sufficiently neutralized in this specific theater, the F-22's unique value proposition diminished faster than the F-35's did. The F-35 still has an active, ongoing role to play in a strike-heavy campaign given its sensor and coordination capabilities, while the F-22's core mission of denying enemy airspace becomes progressively less necessary the longer a genuinely uncontested air environment persists. That's a meaningful distinction for understanding troop and aircraft movements throughout this entire war, and it's exactly the kind of technical nuance that a simple stealth fighters withdrawing headline tends to flatten out entirely. I want to bring this back to something I've covered in multiple other videos because I think it actually complicates the F-22 is no longer needed conclusion slightly in a way worth being honest about. I've noted in my coverage of the B-1 deployment that Western Iran has seen the concentrated weight of this air campaign's suppression efforts, while Eastern Iran has seen significantly fewer strikes and likely remains too risky for non-stealth bomber operations without additional suppression work. If that assessment is accurate, it raises a genuine question about whether the F-22's departure reflects a judgment that Eastern Iran's air defenses simply aren't going to be tested in the near term, or whether it instead reflects the kind of resource-driven rotational necessity I've described throughout this video, with the risk being that if operations ever do need to expand meaningfully into that less suppressed eastern territory, particularly around a target like Pickaxe Mountain, which I've covered extensively and which sits deep in Iran's interior, the air superiority guarantee the F-22 provides might need to be surged back into theater on relatively short notice. That's worth watching for. Specifically, if reporting ever emerges showing F-22s redeploying back toward this theater at the same time attention on Pickaxe Mountain intensifies further, that combination would represent a genuinely different and more significant signal than anything covered in this video so far, precisely because it would suggest planners are specifically reestablishing the kind of uncontested air environment that a deep strike into less suppressed eastern Iranian airspace would likely require. I think the honest read here is that dramatic hours left framing doesn't match what's actually been reported. The F-22 already did its job in this war, establishing air superiority in the opening 72 hours back in February and March. And that job doesn't need repeating unless Iran somehow rebuilds a meaningful air threat, which nothing in this war's trajectory suggests is happening. Its recent departure looks a lot more like a rotational drawdown amid a genuinely stretched global force posture than the build-up to some imminent new strike. I'd be cautious about any framing suggesting a countdown to a specific dramatic event involving this aircraft right now. The actual reporting points the other direction entirely. So that's the real F-22 story, a genuinely important role in this war's opening days, and a recent likely routine or resource-driven withdrawal rather than a build-up to anything imminent. I'll keep tracking the actual bomber and fighter posture in this theater as it develops. I also want to leave you with a broader thought about how to evaluate stories like this one going forward. Throughout this entire series, I've tried to draw a clear line between confirmed troop and aircraft movements, which are genuinely trackable through open source flight data and defense reporting, and the speculative framing that often gets layered on top of those movements to manufacture urgency. Aircraft rotate in and out of theaters constantly, for reasons ranging from routine scheduling to acute crisis response to genuine strategic repositioning, and figuring out which category any specific movement actually falls into requires looking past the headline and into the underlying pattern. Exactly what I've tried to do here by placing this F-22 withdrawal alongside the B-52, F-15E, and A-10 departures happening in the same window, and against the broader multi-theater strain I've documented in my other recent videos. That kind of pattern recognition is a lot less flashy than a countdown clock, but I think it gets you a lot closer to actually understanding where this war is headed. What do you guys think? Does this kind of rotational drawdown change how you're reading the overall trajectory of this conflict? Let me know in the comments below. I read everyone. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.